The Wisdom of Gor, Episode 4. There are several issues woven into the narrative of the third Gor novel, so we will be speaking about these issues for the next few videos. If God had a name, what would it be? And would you call it to his face if you were faced with him in all of his glory? What would you ask if you had just one question? What if God was one of us, by Joan Osborne. The Priest Kings of Gor could easily have been the ending of a trilogy of sword and planet books, not unlike C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy, which seems woefully underread these days, I might add. That would be Pelandra, Out of the Silent Planet, and That Hideous Strength, if I remember the novels correctly. But instead, the book ends with a lead into the fourth novel, The Nomads of Gor. Yet during Priest King of Gor's narrative, we are presented with what is perhaps the first question every culture has ever asked. Is there a God? If so, what does it want from men? The answer is particularly Gorean and horrific. Tarl's father remarks upon the supposed divinity of the priest kings in the first novel, Tarnsmen of Gor, but they make no appearance in the novel except for their abduction of Tarl. Then an outlaw of Gor, the priest kings arise again as a punitive and cruel force that have cursed Tarl. When the third novel opens, Tarl Cabot is seeking the priest kings to make them answer why they've destroyed Koroba, his Gorian home, scattered its people, and made him an outlaw. He arrives in the Sardar Mountains, the Gorean home of the priest kings, to which no normal animal nor any man willingly goes, unless it's at the end of their life. Here he comes across a gate, and like many fraternal or occult bedecked ceremonies, he is challenged by an initiate if he truly wishes to proceed. Tarl answers in the affirmative, and we see him again begin the adventure of a novel. What we discover is that the gods of Gor, these priest kings, are far worse than any petty Olympian. After some misadventures with a spokesperson for the priest kings named Parp and a chamber slave named Vika, Tarl gets to meet the priest kings in the flesh. Rather, we should say in the chitin, for the priest kings are a highly evolved race of giant insects, resembling something of a cross between ants and praying mantis. Nearly 20 feet in length and armored with a formidable carapace, the priest kings are nearly invulnerable to any man-made device, though Tarl does manage to wound them in combat scenes later. Hey, pays to be the hero. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, Clarke's third law. It is revealed to us that the priest kings can control gravity itself, and that by means of this technology they have not only produced floating vehicles and drones, but they can move entire planets. With this technology, they have moved Gor itself from wherever it first was formed to the counterbalance point on the far side of Earth's own orbit. They possess weaponry that can disintegrate matter or evaporate it with heat. Their ability to modify genetic codes allows them to tailor life forms to the priest king's purposes. Through cybernetic systems, they can quickly teach other priest kings the near entirety of their learning, and also see through the eyes of human agents, or even control those actions of the implanted agents. By means of these agents and manipulators, the priest kings control the political and social elements of Gor. By a fleet of drones, they can monitor the actions of the populace with an unseen surveillance state. The priest kings have even nearly conquered death through a series of serums that prevent them from aging. The comparison of the priest kings to gods is therefore not one that is inappropriate. This same comparison is made by Tarl's father in the first novel. Indeed, the only vulnerability the priest kings seem to have is that they are sensitive to sunlight, and that there is another large insect that has evolved, a narcotic pheromone, that causes the priest kings to lose control of their will, but these golden beetles are easily avoided. How dare you create a world in which there is such misery? That is not our fault. It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? Comedian Stephen Fry. The priest kings have the ability, but not the desire, to create a paradise upon Gor. They allow humans to make war on one another instead. They strike down any human who invents a prohibited technology with the flame breath. Not unlike we today use drones in proxy warfare, I might add. They do nothing to disabuse the human Goreans of the notion that priest kings are divine and allow the initiates to control the common Goreans' thinking. They also keep humans as a slave workforce, or experimental testing base, inside the subterranean nest in which they reside. When Misk, whom we could call a friendly priest king, is asked by Tarl why the priest kings keep conditions on Gor the way they are. The priest king replies, "We leave them, humans, free to love and slay one another. It seems to be what they enjoy the most." And to further make the priest kings seem to occupy the moral high ground in comparison to humanity, Misk dares Tarl to explain that the priest king treatment of humanity is any different than how humanity treats animals. Misk points out that priest kings do not consume the flesh of lower species, such as humans do, and for humans the choice to consume meat is optional. Side note, I have some minor quibbles with that sentiment, because dietary explorations, because I have some issues calling it dietary science. Dietary explorations have proven that, there might be a very valid reason why humans need to eat meat as omnivores, though at the time the novel was written, not as much was known about dietary supplements and sciences and nutrition as is known now. But back to the discussion. The priest kings believe that their treatment of Gorean humans is actually a form of preservation for the human species, much as we would allow a nature preserve to be a habitat for birds or animals. Misk even remarks that at times the priest kings will destroy a city of humans at random, even if they have not broken any of their laws, just to keep the humans of the surface superstitiously afraid of the priest kings. Nor are the priest kings impressed with Earth, convinced that due to human psychology that all life on Earth will disappear in 1,000 years because of the human tendency to tribalistic violence and rage. Yet Misk does not have this opinion of Tarl, saying that the priest kings have known and worked with the Cabots for nearly 400 years and are convinced that the Cabots have a streak of mercy in them. It is because of that mercy that Misk has recruited Tarl in his attempt to save the newly born male priest king, the first male in a very long time, and the first female egg, which is the plot of the fourth novel. Most of the priest kings, we are told, live in a neutered third gender. They cannot produce new offspring of their own. Only the new males and new female queens that are born can do so. We are also shown that, like an arrogant god, Misk sees nothing wrong in what he has arranged to happen in Tarl's life. It is revealed that Misk is the priest king that sent the ship to collect Tarl. It is Misk that planned the eradication of Koroba. It is Misk that has parted Tarl from those he loves, and all of this was done so that Tarl would seek out the priest kings and do Misk's bidding, without Sarm, a rival priest king, thinking that Tarl is but Misk's agent. It might even be Misk's influence that exiled Tarl's mother to Earth, where the environment sickened her to death. Were it not for the mercy of the Cabot family, Misk's plan would have gone awry. And it is also clear to us, the reader, that despite their advanced technology, the priest kings cannot accurately predict all human behavior or events, nor have they managed to eliminate character defaults such as greed, pride, avarice, and wrath from their own psyches. Sarm and Misk will begin a civil war over each's vision of the future of what the priest king race should be. And this conflict has begun because Sarm has convinced the mother of the species to back his schemes to escape death and remain the head of a hierarchy out of pride and megalomania. Neither Sarm nor Misk can even correctly predict the actions of the other, as Sarm continuously breaks the taboos of the priest kings to Misk's disbelief, and Misk proves able to think outside the social norms of a priest king, at least tactically, in ways that Sarm refuses to entertain. There's even a comment about how a society that a tyrant attempts to purify, as Sarm attempts to do, will fail because the members of it are impure in the tyrant's esteem and will simply flock to the opposing side, bolstering its numbers and military capacity, if not its social harmony and creative output. This particularly happens when Sarm refuses to use humans to supplement his army, but Miska does so, and what human slaves that Sarm has quickly defect. Many of Sarm's tactics backfire like this, as he relies solely upon the vision of the priest kings as superior beings, and the use of humanity by Misk's forces prevents the use of humanity by Misk's forces proves Misk's army's salvation, as the humans are immune to many of the tactics that Sarm uses. Our hero Tarl eventually helps produce the victory for the heroes. I suppose we should call these heroic army the reformed priest kings, and the novel's cumulative fight scene between Tarl and Sarm is actually fairly nail-biting. Multiple times in the novel, Sarm is believed to have been defeated, only to escape. It's very comic booky in that respect. The last time he is deserted by his own forces and is believed to have fled the nest. But in fact, Sarm intends to use a Priest King device, their main power plant, to destroy the planet. In the conversation between heat blasts and sword strokes, we learn that Sarm has descended into a kind of religious madness, convinced that he and he alone is the only remaining true Priest King. Tarl combats him and does a fair job of delaying the Priest King, but victory ultimately comes from the appearance of a golden beetle and its narcotic pheromones. The beetle slays Sarm, and then Tarl slays the beetle. In the aftermath of the war, the novel tells us that the Priest Kings that now reside in the nest will obey Misk, and that Misk is making a society that allows humans a place in it alongside the Priest Kings. How equal that arrangement is going to be is never brokered. Humans are allowed to leave the nest, but find that Gorayans on the surface are led by hostile initiates, who turn the Gorayans against this formerly nest-born group of humans, lest the real Gorayans, as the initiates would have it, learn the truth. Now that may seem pat as a plot point, but keep in mind that in real-world history, the United States was turning people away from Hitler's Germany, that were fleeing it, trying to get to our shores. Those in control of a society are always capable of great evil, and at least a little bit of myopic thinking. And speaking of evil and myopic thinking, the book ends with an interesting comment on the nature of dogmatic religions and their concept of God. Tarl and Vika leave the nest and encounter a group of Gorayans, led by initiates, performing sacrifices below the mountains to appease the Priest Kings. The various environmental disasters that Sarm has caused in his war have been taken by the Gorayans as a sign of divine wrath. Now, before you laugh that one off, consider that in our own real world, a natural disaster being claimed to be the work of malign forces, or as punishment for sins prompting God's anger, is still quite common, even into the modern era. From Jerry Falwell's claims that the attacks on the Twin Towers was a punishment from God against America for allowing members of different religions and sexualities to be citizens, to Muslim imams claiming that the tsunamis of the Pacific spelt the name of Allah in their waves, to claims that AIDS and COVID are signs of the end times, our populace in the real world is not more rational than that of the fictional Gorayans. Tarl attempts to speak to these assembled Gorayans, but confronted by the initiates, he is a bit slow of tongue, and they warp the Gorayan perception of Tarl's having survived the Sardar Mountains with cunning lies. That's not a comment on the priesthood. The lead initiate says to Tarl later, "With most, as you think, they are simple, believing members of my caste. And there are others who suspect the truth and are tormented, or whom suspect the truth and will pretend. But I, High Initiate of R, and certain others of the High Initiates, are like none of these." "And how do you differ?" I, Tarl speaking, asked. "I, and some others," he said, "wait for man." He looked at me. "He is not yet ready." "For what?" "To believe in himself." A little later on, finishes the conversation with the following comment. "Thus unknown to most members of my caste, we exist to be overcome. Thus we will point man towards his own greatness." Now that may seem deceptive and monstrous at first, and it may sound something more in line with Stephen Fry's opinion of religion and God's nature. When confronted with the problem of theodicy, Fry remarks about that concept of God as, "It's perfectly apparent that he is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. The moment you banish him, life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner, more worth living, in my opinion." But I do not think that Norman or the Gorayans would agree, for it seems in Norman's mind that God is not so much a being, but an ethic that one emulates and manifests. In the second book, Outlaw of Gor, Tar tells the reader something of this when he mentions that a Gorayan man of his city lives for his city. The pride, character, and expectations being a man of that city influence the man's actions and prevent him, ideally, from acting in a way that would dishonor the city or himself. Combined with his dialogue of alms, it seems that Norman is making an argument about God that I once actually heard a rabbi make. Paraphrased, it went something like this. We use Abba in Aramaic to call out to God. The word means father. Throughout the Jewish and Christian tradition, this divine parentage has been used as a metaphor for our experience with God. Like your father provides a place for you, so God has provided a place for the world. Like your father cannot prevent you from being harmed, having your heart broken, or making a mistake, So God allows you to learn, knowing that is the only way you will accept what you learn. Like a father whose job it is to guide you into adulthood by rules and expectations given to you in childhood, so God gives us a religion, a mythos, and an ethic. The ultimate goal of any parent is to make themselves useless by their child becoming a capable adult. Now, what must that say about God? And while some fundamentalists might find that argument to be bordering on Fry's atheism, I find it typically Jewish and wise. And it seems that many of the philosophers of old, Marcus Aurelius for instance, would agree with the rabbi's sentiment. Since it is possible that thou mayest depart from this life at this very moment, regulate every act and thought accordingly. But to go away from among men, if there are gods, is not a thing to be afraid of, for the gods will not involve thee in evil. But if indeed they do not exist, or if they have no concern about human affairs, what is it to me to live in a universe devoid of gods or devoid of providence? But in truth they do exist, and they do care for human things, and they have put all the means in man's power to enable him not to fall into real evils. And as to the rest, if there was anything evil, they would have provided for this also, that it should be altogether in man's power not to fall into it. Marcus Aurelius. I believe that's Meditations, if I remember correctly. And like a parent who is there to listen and advise their child, I would argue that an ethical and virtue being that we would call God. I'm sorry, let me repeat that. And like a parent who is there to listen and to advise their adult child, I would argue that an ethical and virtuous being, for which we use God as a shorthand for, is always there for its child, man, to reflect and review upon what man should do next, but always leaves the decision up to man, as a father always leaves their decisions for their lives up to their child. And this is almost exactly what happens in the priest-king society. As the once enslaved humans enter into the new social order with the priest-kings, they have aided in defeating Sarn. The last scene of the novel is of Tarl and Misk speaking of the momentary beauty of life, in which the Gorean god remarks that as far as Misk is concerned, the best thing a rational being can do is act in such a manner that they would be content to stand on the virtue of their action as being noble and good, no matter how many times the universe may destroy itself and create life anew. This observation closely follows Nietzsche's philosophical concept of the eternal recurrence, a concept that so many people in the media have misunderstood. With that conversation, Tarl decides that he will, though he did not originally mean to, go and seek out the remaining female priest-king egg that has gone lost, that this race may not vanish from existence. And here is where some people have an issue with Tarl's mercy. I admit, I sympathize with their argument. For we know that a few of the priest-kings, Misk and Kusk in particular, are willing to entertain the idea of humanity having more worth than animals. But this is the race that has kept humanity oppressed for at least 10,000 years, in conditions that have enslaved most of the population. How could such a race be trusted? The priest-kings have a heavy weight of years upon them, traditions that simply will not break. And with that lengthy weight of years and iron tradition, there is a standing within it of humanity always being considered below the priest-kings, at least as servants. How long in priest-king society will it take for another Sarm to arise? I think of real-world Germany and Europe today. Since the fall of fascism, there has been a subculture of neo-Nazism always threatening to rise. And now with the pressures of immigration, religious violence, disease, and economic downturns, this neo-fascism is attracting many members to its cause who would otherwise reject it. The questions of the novel Priest-Kings of Gor are many and varied. This was just the first one. It essentially posits an argument where God, if God exists, is a very hands-off deistic figure. That happened to be part of my thinking before I read the novels, so perhaps I'm reading a little into it on that regard. But it does seem to be consistent with the rest of the morality and operating ethics of Norman's fictional world. Perhaps it's true of ours as well.